The cargo ship was massive, 18,000 tons of clean golden corn, not a single insect, no contamination, no delay. But still, port officials wouldn't let it dock. The reason? Not what was inside the bags, but what was printed on them. Product of the United States. Within hours, the shipment was rejected. Within weeks, so were dozens of others. Not because the corn had changed, but because the world's perception of American agriculture had. Suddenly, across Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, contracts that once arrived like clockwork were quietly withdrawn. Entire deals vanished without explanation. American farmers watched their silos fill to the brim, while the phones stopped ringing. But while the U.S. scrambled to understand what went wrong, Canada didn't say a word. No press conferences, no policy threats. Just quiet, steady moves, slipping into the very same trade rooms the U.S. once dominated, offering the exact same corn, at the exact same price. Only this time, buyers said yes. The label read, "Product of Canada." And somehow, that was all it took. The collapse didn't start in a boardroom. It started in a quiet barn in Iowa, where corn sat bagged and ready, yet no trucks came to pick it up. For years, Iowa was the crown jewel of American agriculture. Fields so vast they seemed endless, farms passed down through generations, and a rhythm of planting and harvesting so reliable it became background noise. But in 2025, that rhythm stopped. Nearly half of the state's corn exports, over 40%, were suddenly canceled. No warning, no explanation, just silence. That's enough corn to feed 200 million people now sitting in storage, gathering dust. Warehouses that once bustled with forklifts and conveyor belts now echo with stillness. Ethanol plants that used to process around the clock have gone dark. And cooperatives, once the center of rural life, are shuttering early, some permanently. One farmer near Cedar Rapids put it plainly, "We don't want subsidies, we want buyers, but our corn just sits there, season after season." But this wasn't just Iowa's problem, because once the heart of the agricultural machine begins to falter, what happens to the rest of the system? And to see just how far the ripple spreads, we need to follow it downstream, across the river to Nebraska, where a single rejection at sea revealed something even more alarming. The fields are golden, the silos are full, but the money isn't moving, and neither is the corn. Warehouses that used to hum with machines and early morning deliveries now sit frozen in silence. The forklifts are parked. The conveyor belts are still. Ethanol plants that once swallowed truckloads of corn each day now sit dormant, some indefinitely. Even the cooperatives, the community's last thread of hope, are shutting their gates before sundown. What used to be the most active place in town now echoes like an abandoned factory. One farmer outside Cedar Rapids summed it up without emotion. "We don't need aid, we just need to sell corn." He stood beside harvesters covered in dust, not because they were old, but because they hadn't been used in weeks. It didn't take long for Nebraska's warning signs to show. Not in spreadsheets or reports, but on the open sea. A massive cargo ship carrying 18,000 tons of Nebraska corn reached the port of Shanghai. But instead of offloading, it was turned away. The reason? Uncertain origin. A term so vague it could mean anything or nothing. The corn was clean. It met every prior requirement. The only thing wrong? The label, "Product of the United States." That single rejection triggered a chain reaction. Within weeks, other shipments were delayed or quietly dropped. Export totals plunged 47% in just the first quarter of the year. And back in Nebraska, it wasn't just the economy taking the hit, it was people's identities. Farmers who once proudly called themselves suppliers to the world now find themselves drowning in debt, applying for emergency credit just to avoid foreclosure. Contracts that once arrived like clockwork have vanished. Phones stopped ringing. Emails go unanswered. As one former grain buyer in Lincoln said, "We didn't change, the world did, and we didn't see it coming." But Nebraska's story doesn't stop there. Because when a global market moves on from you, without a fight, without a word, it begs a much bigger question. What happens to the communities built on those contracts? To answer that, we have to look at what happened next in Indiana, where a single phone call was all it took to unravel an entire town. In Indiana, it didn't happen at the docks. It happened over the phone. A single call, one sentence. A contract with Mexico, worth tens of millions, was canceled. No explanation, no renegotiation, just a quiet withdrawal. Within 60 days, 70 workers were out of jobs. Grain elevators shut their gates. The local diner closed. The school laid off staff. People started packing. The town, once woven together by a corn economy, began to unravel. Not because of a natural disaster, not because of bad harvests, simply because one deal, one handshake, vanished, and nothing replaced it. This season's crop, there's simply no room left to store it. This wasn't just an economic hit. It was a loss of rhythm, of meaning. The kind of slow fade that doesn't make headlines, but leaves a permanent mark on every empty store window. But Indiana's story isn't unique, because if a single contract can end an entire town, what happens when the whole system starts collapsing one state at a time? To see how far the cracks go, we now head to Illinois and Minnesota, two states where the corn hasn't stopped growing, but the world has stopped buying. In Illinois, the silence isn't just in the fields, it's in the storage yards. Bins once emptied weekly are now overflowing. Corn from last season still sits, unsold. Near Cairo and Springfield, elevators have stopped accepting deliveries. Grain piles and makeshift tarps, exposed to the elements. The smell of rot replaces the usual scent of fresh grain. Farmers don't even ask about prices anymore. They ask if anyone is buying at all. Meanwhile, in Minnesota, the impact is felt far beyond the farm. In the industrial outskirts of Minneapolis, massive packaging warehouses have gone quiet. Truck routes have been slashed, and entire logistics contracts have been canceled. One woman who worked in quality control for a grain processor summed it up bitterly. "I've never planted a seed in my life, but I lost my job because nobody buys corn anymore." And here's the deeper cost. These weren't just jobs. They were the backbone of small communities. When the corn stopped moving, so did the people, the paychecks, and the purpose. And lately, the US has offered too many variables and too few assurances. To understand that, we have to zoom out, not just to the farms, but to the systems behind them. Because this story isn't just about rejected grain, it's about lost trust. The corn didn't change, but the trust behind it did. For decades, American corn was a default choice, reliable, abundant, and fast. But behind the scenes, the systems that supported that reliability began to crack. Importing countries don't just buy grain, they buy stability. They need to know that next month's shipment won't be held up by a surprise inspection. That next year's pricing won't be upended by a policy reversal. Shifting tariffs, suspended trade deals, inconsistent inspection protocols. Buyers began to wonder, if we can't predict how the US will operate next season, why should we rely on them this one? The Mexico case made things worse. When Mexico tried to ban GMO corn, the US fought back through the USMCA and won. But in doing so, it reinforced a growing perception that buying American corn could come with political strings attached. And for many buyers, that was the final straw. But this isn't just about legal battles. It's about perception, confidence. A system that once ran on trust now runs on uncertainty. And when that trust erodes, other players start stepping into the vacuum. So who did the world turn to instead? To find that answer, we need to look just a few hundred miles north, where a quieter, slower, but far more consistent player was ready to rise. While the U.S. debated policy and battled rejection, Canada made its move, without saying a word. No headlines, no trade wars, just quiet execution. Starting in early 2025, Canadian trade officials were already in rooms the U.S. used to dominate. They weren't promising lower prices or flashier deals. They were offering one thing: stability. South Korea, Japan, Mexico, the European Union all quietly signed new import agreements with Canada. Not because Canada grows better corn, but because they know what to expect from it. Behind the scenes, provinces like Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba had been laying the groundwork for years. They invested in systems that let buyers trace corn from seed to shipment, using real-time data, QR codes, and even blockchain to verify origin. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't fast, but it built something the U.S. had lost: trust. And when global buyers looked around for a reliable plan B, Canada was already ready. Canadian corn began showing up on docks that once unloaded only American grain. Ships were cleared faster, contracts were renewed without drama, and buyers started calling Canada first, not out of loyalty, but out of relief. This wasn't a takeover, it was a quiet substitution. But if Canada can step in this smoothly, without disrupting the market, what happens when other countries follow suit? To see the full picture, we have to look beyond the farms, to the ripple effects across every job, town, and family tied to American corn. The corn crisis isn't just about grain sitting in silos. It's about what happens when that corn no longer moves. Every million bushels not exported sends out shockwaves. About 200 jobs lost, not on farms, but in the spaces connected to them. Truckers with canceled routes. Processing plant workers sent home early. Warehouse packers with empty shifts. The ripple spreads into packaging suppliers, rail logistics, fertilizer plants, even small-town diners that relied on lunch crowds from nearby mills. Because if trust in American agriculture continues to erode, this ripple won't stop at small towns. It will reach cities, supply chains, and even your own dinner plate. Some layoffs made the local paper, most didn't. And as the economic base shrinks, so does the community around it. Schools in farming counties report falling enrollment. Churches are closing their doors. Rural pharmacies, already hanging by a thread, now struggle to keep their shelves stocked. What began as an export issue has turned into a slow bleed. One that doesn't make headlines, but hollows out the core of rural America. And this is just the start. And the next generation may not inherit the family farm, but the weight of its decline. In the last 6 months, over 30,000 indirect jobs have vanished in the sector. Rural schools are closing for lack of students. Churches without congregations. Pharmacies without customers. If the U.S. doesn't act, the consequences will stretch far beyond the fields. Contracts will vanish. Communities will shrink. And the nation's identity as a global agricultural power may quietly slip away, without ceremony, without notice. But decline is not destiny. If the U.S. chooses to respond, not with noise, but with clarity, there's still a path forward. A path where trust is rebuilt not through promises, but through proof. Through systems that work. Through partnerships that last. Through harvests that move again. Because corn, in its simplest form, is just a crop. But in the hands of a nation, it becomes something more: sustenance, stability, and story. And in that story, there is still time to write a better ending.